hearings. My name is Diego Garcia, professional now here today, and today with
Bell Shield.
Okay. For round two, we have the motion. This House believes that the protection of international law, convention, and treaties should not apply to combatants from terrorist organizations. Now we call upon the President to speak. Everyone is agreeing to that?
International law is a balance between our aspiration for decency and pragmatism about the nature of war. Terrorists who refuse to engage with us on our own terms can engage us not as combatants, but as people who are willing to attack and destroy civilians' lives, do not deserve the reasonable respect that we afford to soldiers. But even if they did in a moral and principled sense, there is no value in a norm of international law that goes abysmally unenforced and provides very little protection to anyone apart from destroying the credibility of those international institutions in the first place. That's why we propose this motion. What do we mean? 3 things to clarify. First, we think this motion concerns international courts rather than individual countries deciding who does and who does not qualify as a terrorist, and that classification might change. So, for example, we think conceivably in 25 years' time, the Taliban could be reclassified away from being a terrorist organization. Second, what protections are we talking about? We're talking about the ones in the info slide. So, for example, we would be happy to torture terrorists, we would be happy to ensure that they were not released even at the conclusion of conflicts when peace deals were to be signed. Obviously, we don't need to say that those tools like torture are effective in every instance, since the point is it will be up to states to choose to use them where they believe that it is necessary. We just think that they should have the principled right to use them, and they'll use them in the right ways. Lastly, what is a terrorist? We don't think this debate applies to situations in which people are clearly not consenting to be terrorists. So, for example, we don't think we need to take on burdens like torture of child soldiers or people who have been conscripted by terrorist groups. Clearly, the motion is referring to people who have chosen to be terrorists, which is what we'll talk about in this debate. If any of that's unclear, I'm happy to take a point of information. Otherwise, I'm going to move to my arguments, which will be threefold. First, I'm going to explain why, in principle, there is no obligation to extend to terrorists the protections we give to soldiers. Now I'll explain why, even disregarding the effects of this policy, there is no requirement to have these regulations in international law. Secondly, I'll explain why, even if in a perfect world we would like to give terrorists these protections, relaxing these protections is necessary to fight terror, which is a far bigger humanitarian threat and more important. And lastly, I'll explain why this creates better respect for international law. To the first point. These restrictions on fighting arose in the context of state-state structured warfare, and to apply them to terrorists is incoherent. First, terrorists have consented to be combatants, whereas soldiers have not. The vast majority of states in times of war rely on conscription. Even where they don't rely on conscription, there is typically a universal state narrative and a large amount of state media that deprives people from gaining information about what the other side is really fighting for. That is not the case for terrorists, who typically consent to join their terrorist organizations. Because even if you were to look at the most Taliban-infested parts of Afghanistan, in those places, the vast majority of people are not members of the Taliban, which is a clear indication of the fact that they have other sources of information which could have explained to them why they should not make that choice. Second, there is no reciprocity in this relationship. The point of these restrictions is pragmatic. You maintain decency, I maintain decency, and we understand that both sides are better off. It's unreasonable to insist that a state maintain those protections when its fighting partner, a terrorist organisation, refuses to do so, because that puts them at a real relative disadvantage and means that, for example, it is more likely that civilian lives will be lost, because even if you don't think terrorists have perfectly consented, clearly they have consented to a greater extent than innocent civilians have. The third reason why terrorists are different is because they engage not as combatants, but against the very life and existence of a state. And that's the reason why we should understand war as an unfortunate set of circumstances, which we should try to make as bearable as possible, but we should not understand terrorism in the same way, because these people are not engaging in a legitimate enterprise, they are engaging in an enterprise that is attacking civilians and attacking the existence of the state itself. That's why it's unreasonable to insist on the same protections for terrorists that we should have elsewhere. My second argument is that relaxing these restrictions is necessary to fight terror. We think that even if in a perfect world we would like to afford terrorists these protections, it is more important to protect the lives of civilians for 2 reasons. Firstly, that for every terrorist who is tortured, for example, even if that is a violation of their rights, there are dozens of innocent civilians who, for example, would be less likely to be subject to Al-Shabaab's attacks if we were more effective in fighting against Al-Shabaab. Secondly, and the second reason why it's more important to protect civilians is because they are people who have not at all consented to be put at the risks which terrorists are imposing. We think it's necessary to relax all of these restrictions together rather than just doing it in a piecemeal kind of relax one restriction or relax one other restriction, because that would make the divide in international law very unclear and blurry, which is why it's better to have one set of regulations for soldiers and one set of regulations for terrorists. So why is this necessary? First, it's necessary to avoid release of terrorists. Because even if FARC chooses to give up arms, that is no guarantee that the FARC soldiers who we have captured will not choose to recommit terrorist offences at the conclusion of a peace agreement. So realistically, the opposition bench needs to defend those people being let out of their cells, which has a huge risk of recidivism and inflaming conflicts. That's because terrorist ideology is fragmentary. So even if the leader of your cell has a particular view, you might not follow it as the individual terrorist. Secondly, it's necessary to limit outside exposure. Normally, international law affords a right to communicate, like to talk to your home government or to talk to the media. But that's an incredibly dangerous thing for terrorist groups, because you know that having the leaders of terrorist groups being capable of espousing their ideology is something that fosters those groups. Third, it's necessary to get information. We think that torture can be somewhat effective. It's almost impossible to train someone for those experiences. There's a reason why Mossad is so successful in doing it. And that's why it would be valuable if we could use torture as a tactic to get information. Lastly though, and crucially, we need public faith in the fight against terrorists, and if the public believes we are being soft in that fight, we will lose their support. So for instance, in Colombia, if right-wing people in Colombia believe that they cannot trust the Colombian government to be fighting as hard against FARC as possible, it is more likely that they will take the law into their own hands. Most members of the public consider it incredibly unreasonable when politicians talk about the rights and human interests of the terrorists who have been blowing up their local schools, which is why we generate the public support that's required. Closing.
The extent of your principled argument is to prove that the terrorists are not analogous to soldiers, but they're still humans. If the basis for this principled argument for no torture is that a human right, how does your argument actually work?
It applies fully in the sense that I've explained. Firstly, that those people have consented to those risks. Secondly, that we should not afford them the rights of human beings, since the rights of freedom, for example, from torture, because there is no reciprocity. Thirdly, I've explained that the rights of civilians are more important than the rights of terrorists. My last point is that this is a proposal that will generate better respect for international law. Essentially what I want to say is that any attempts to extend these prohibitions to terrorists would be of almost zero practical value, because it's very unlikely that any state in the world would follow it, which is why, for example, the United States, Israel, Russia and China do regularly torture terrorists. Why is that? Firstly, because there's political pressure to go as hard as possible to fight terrorists, and you don't want to be the guy in the election who's sticking up for their human rights. And second, because the mechanism of international law makes enforcement incredibly hard, especially when the countries that would enforce it against you, like for example the United States, also have blood on their hands, so there's no reason for them to do so. We want to hear from the opposition bench, what is the value of an international norm that goes almost entirely unenforced? The harm of that international norm is that it destroys the credibility of international law elsewhere. So if people view international law as unrealistic, they think that its prohibitions cannot make sense in times of crisis, it is less likely they will respect any of those prohibitions at all. By contrast, most people are capable of understanding why soldiers should be afforded dignity, because they understand and have respect for soldiers in a way they do not for terrorists. This norm is ineffective, it does not work, and it is wrong. We propose.
Thank you very much. So we will go on to the leader of the opposition.
My biggest issue with the previous speech is that they failed to identify the goal of today's debate round. And we think that the goal of today's debate round is to end the violence and to do so in the most effective way possible. We think that in order to do so, it's best to focus on prioritizing the humanity of individuals, prioritizing the moral quality of humanity, and not do things like torture individuals or hold them indefinitely in order to just get back at them in the same way that they got to you. Because we think that it's going to be more effective in the long run for the stability of countries and of the world, for governments to prioritize the moral qualities of even individuals who commit heinous acts, we are going to oppose. A few things in rebuttal. First, so they talk about this principle, which was really interesting, about how terrorists are less than human, therefore we should prioritize other humans over them. A lot of issues with this. First, so before I get into the issues with that, I just like to analyze a little bit about terrorist organizations in the very first place, how they form and why they exist, right? Because they don't just pop out of nowhere. They come to fruition, oftentimes because they think that the government of their country has failed them, that they're being actively attacked by the government. Their rights are being usurped, and they don't have any other way of getting their voice out there, right? So oftentimes, like, things like voting are ineffective in the area, they don't have any political capital, they don't have anybody who they can voice their opinions to and be heard. So what they do is they turn to violent measures in order to try to get change. We've seen this a number of times around the world, like Syria, we've seen this in Turkey, Sinan probably knows a little bit more about that, but the Kurds in Turkey have been like they're labeled as a terrorist organization there, and we think that this is something that like oftentimes comes out of a lack of like focus by the government, and then they just gets like out of control over time. So then, why do we think that these people are still people, why they still deserve the same rights responding to this point? First, because oftentimes these people have been radicalized in a way that like isn't necessarily their fault. Oftentimes these like people grow up in these areas where they're just told, they're given fed propaganda over and over again saying that this government is so bad and we have to do anything in order to stop them. That includes things like violent attacks on innocent civilians. Given that that's the case, why do we think that it's abhorrent to torture these individuals in order and like usurp their humanity in order to try to get information? First, because we think that human life comes oftentimes before like the information that they're going to get. The best case scenario that we got from OG is like if you torture someone, maybe you get a little bit of information from them. Two things. First, torture has been proven time and time again in studies of like the information that is given and then whether that actually led to any tangible result to be ineffective. There are a lot other more effective techniques that are used, such as like pitting individuals against one another, holding them in different rooms and trying to like get information from them simultaneously, other things like that. We think that torture, oftentimes what happens, one of the studies I was reading found that they just lie in order to get you to stop torturing them. They'll try to get you to just kill them. Like they'll just like say things to try to get you to kill them. They'll do anything to stop the pain. Like these are, like torture isn't just like regular pain, it's like intense pain that is specifically focused on like trying to get you, push you over the edge. The second thing that they talked about was why they should keep them indefinitely. They said that like there's going to be, so my response to this is like I think this is a loss of bargaining power. What happens right now is oftentimes there will be like prisoner exchanges where you'll exchange like, I think of last year, there was some exchange for like 40 kids, I think it was Nigeria, where they were exchanged for like a few terrorists that were released, right? We think that that's like an effective way of doing business. The final point that they talked about was how public faith in, the public faith within like the countries. So a few things. First, we think that there's actually going to be a decrease in faith in the government and the legitimacy of the government when you are seen as doing the exact same things that you're chastising the terrorist organizations for doing. When you're capturing these individuals, holding them indefinitely, when you're torturing them, when you're submitting them to the same inhumane conditions that you are saying is so wrong, we think that the public is going to lose faith in the government because of the fact that they don't see them as any different. What this then leads to is that there will be an increase in membership of these terrorist organizations because they can simply point to the fact that the government is doing the exact same thing that they're saying is so bad. And they can say, if the government can do it, so can we. If the government can use violence in order to get what they want, so can we. Now, let's talk about the principle of humanity and human dignity. So I already talked a little bit early on about how these people are just regular humans who have oftentimes become radicalized. But I'd like to add a few things to this. First, so the function and goal of many terrorist organizations after they form is to just like strike fear in people's hearts to change the order of things and to just like get more power, right? They do this oftentimes by inflicting violence on individuals and just like radicalizing people as much as they can, right? So we think that the second point under this is like the function of governments is to protect civilians and is to ensure peace and stability within their country. We think that the best way that they can do this is one, by like doing things in order to prevent attacks, but two, by having a sort of moral high ground that they take that says that we are not going to do the same things that our enemies are doing just because they're effective. Look, the entirety of Gov's case is this is something that's effective, therefore we should do it. We think that if you're doing something that is degrading to humanity, like according to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, this is just wrong. According to like a ton of international treaties, this is something that you shouldn't do, right? We need a better justification other than you might save a few lives. Okay, let's talk about the micro level and the macro level before that back up.
I think to draw a parallel between the government torturing a terrorist and the terrorist slaughtering innocent civilians is disingenuous. The government violence against a terrorist is far more justified when that terrorist is complicit in violent actions against innocents.
So that's the same logic that's used, like, if somebody does something bad, it's okay to do something bad against them, right? Like, we're having this debate a lot in the United States about, like, whether the death penalty is okay. If somebody does something bad, whether you then have the right to take their life or to put them in, intense pain. Okay, so let's talk about the micro level first. We think that it's impossible to monitor the torture rooms we saw in the United States, for example. A number of, committees that looked into the CIA torture rooms that have happened in the past have found that they oftentimes go above and beyond, like, what they say they're doing officially, right? We think that that this means, secondly, know that oftentimes this is going to have a lot of damage onto the psyche of the individuals who's tasked with actually having to do this. But third, the public perception of these individuals when you know that your government is actively torturing individuals without the information, right? Because note that the public knows very, very little about what's actually going on inside these rooms. They just know somebody's going in, they're being tortured, and hopefully something good is coming out of it. They know very little more because of that, because of national security, things like that. So we think the public perception is going to often have there's going to be a lot of propaganda saying the government is just doing all of these horrible things, which they probably are doing. Lastly, let's talk about the macro level. Okay, so the impact that this has on society. I talked a little bit about this earlier on about how society loses faith in its government. But secondly, I'd like to add that so it controls the way that we view our enemies, right? So right now the government has this sort of moral high ground. What they're changing it to is we're viewing them as human individuals, and we're viewing them from a lens of fear. We're saying that we are afraid of them, therefore we have to do anything that we can in order to get information and prevent further attacks from happening in the future. The impact that this has on society as a whole over the long term cannot be overstated because of the fact that oftentimes this will mean that society as a whole will view their enemies as someone who is subhuman, who's someone who can you can do anything to them in order to get information. Okay. We think that humanity comes first. We need to prioritize this. That governments have a moral high ground that they need to uphold.
Now we call the Deputy Prime Minister.
The conventions of war are fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with issues of terrorist organisations. They don't recognise the fact that a conflict isn't dealt with neatly by a peace treaty because terrorists, when released, will still commit those crimes. They don't deal with the fact that, by and large, you're not dealing with issues of conscription and you're not even really dealing with issues of brainwash to the same extent as a state apparatus. But the worst thing for this opposition bench isn't just that principally this convention is ill-equipped to deal with terrorist organisations, it's that all states realise that this convention is ill-equipped to deal with terrorist organisations, and as a result, they are not obeying this convention. And in not obeying this convention, despite the fact that they should, this is fundamentally undermining the ability of that convention to hold states accountable in clear conflicts between states or in other issues of human rights. We would rather have a new or abandon entirely the idea that these people should be viewed as soldiers or as combatants and call them what they are, terrorists, and recognise that we shouldn't be using an archaic label to deal with them in a way which is principally unjustified. The first thing I want to deal with in this speech is to rehash the importance of this for respect and implementation of international law, something which was fundamentally under-responded to by our opening opposition. We told you two things here. First, the way that people justify international law and the fact that you need to treat soldiers well can be popular in the idea of state-on-state conflict, but are not popular in dealing with terrorist organisations. I'm pretty sure if you ask your average American, should someone from Al-Qaeda or should someone from ISIS be tortured, they're not going to say, no, they're human like us. They will say, yes, of course, they kill thousands of our civilians, they invade our turf, they go on the internet and hurt our children. The fact that international conventions here are tried to be justified to go with terrorists mean people can't understand the arguments of soldiers being different because that is degraded by what they see as a moral high ground, which is not righteous, but a moral high ground which is stupid and offensive to the people who they see as hurt either day. We would prefer to concentrate our efforts on people recognising, for instance, why people in a state-on-state conflict should be treated decently when they do break out or if they were to break out in the future, rather than waste our ability to try and convince people that soldiers should be seen as human, or dealing with the least sympathetic actor, terrorists, who quite frankly are not sympathetic. But the second thing is that we think that the reality of this debate is that these conventions are not being enforced against terrorists. Terrorists are tortured. Terrorists are not released. Given that, we think that we should recognise that you shouldn't degrade international law and international conventions by attrition, and instead say, we recognise that this is not working in this conflict. Rather than say piecemeal break it down one by one, because that would say any conflict could piecemeal break it down one by one, we will make a clear stance. Soldiers deserve some protections, terrorists do not deserve these protections. If closing opposition wants to say they deserve some protections, that is a reason to rewrite a convention specific for terrorist organisations or terrorists. We simply should say that this, written for soldiers and based on soldiers, should not be applied to terrorists. That's why absolutely this degrades international law in a way which doesn't even protect people if that's what they want to talk about. Secondly, can principally we justify removing these protections? We told you three things at opening government. First, that these people had far more meaningfully consented than soldiers. Second, that there was no ability for these deals to be reciprocal. And third of all, that protections recognise that war is in some instances a legitimate enterprise. Terrorism is never a legitimate enterprise. What does opening opposition want to say? They want to say, well, these people have been brainwashed like they're victims of the state. That is not true. The vast majority of Sunnis in Iraq have not joined ISIS. In fact, they fight against ISIS because they recognise a legitimate way to protest Shia rule is not to blow up citizens in other countries or blow up children or commit heinous acts against women. It is to deal with decent forms of politics. This is not something that we should sanction as legitimate, and that's something that most people intuitively agree with. To the extent that there is, say, conscription or brainwashing, we think that, obviously we think that human shields should still have rights, if that should be carved out in a separate way. We're talking about people who are opting into this, and we would use our best judgment for that. Even in the worst case scenario though, we would prefer to err on the side of caution for civilian life, people who are truly innocent, people who are victims of terrorist organisations and might also be victims of the state but don't want to kill their neighbour because of it, and that's absolutely something that we should care about. CEO here says, but what about the fact that they are human? First of all, we think they forfeited many of their rights. As I explained, that is an argument for perhaps some specific human rights that should be drawn out separately, recognising the difference of conflict, not a reason for using something drawn up after World War II, essentially, to apply to a digital age of terrorism. That's what we absolutely care about. So, given that, what are the practicalities of removing this, and is it something that we should care about in our fight against terror? Closing.
Which do you think incentivizes countries to follow international law more? Weakly enforcing that law, or saying that if you continue to ignore it, we'll just repeal it?
No, because we will explain the reason why it's different. Also, it's not even being weakly enforced, it is being entirely ignored to the celebration of the American population who could not care less about what happens in Guantanamo Bay. We think it is good that there could be a discussion about what are the kind of morals that we care about. That is far more likely to mean people take law seriously rather than people laugh at law. Think about jaywalking laws. The fact it's loosely enforced doesn't mean people take it seriously. It would be far better to say running across a highway is something that's enforced, crossing a residential street is not enforced. That would actually have far more respect for the law. So why is it that we want these protections to lead in our fight against terror? This is incredibly important given we've explained to you that the loss of human life in a by terror organisations is far greater than those people who are involved. The first thing I want to talk about is what opening opposition says about a moral high ground. I've already explained the fact that actually these protections are not unpopular, and even if they were unpopular, terrorist organisations can and do say states are doing this, so they don't have a moral high ground. Far better that the state can have a moral high ground by saying, well, it's not illegal for me to do it, what you are doing is illegal, rather than the state saying, yes, we are degrading international law, so it's fine that a terrorist organisation also degrades international law. We also need the context of many of these conflicts is states cooperating with civilian actors. So for instance, Kurdish militia or Shia militia, in the instance where those militia do want to use tactics like torture because they feel personally affronted, because it makes them feel safer, because they recognise that it is a useful way of getting information, this kind of moral high ground is actually incredibly detrimental for the geopolitics of the region. On top of all of that, we would say things like outside communication, the fact that they release are clear examples of where this is ill-equipped to deal with terrorist organisations. This law is archaic, it's not being applied and shouldn't be applied. It makes international law a laughing stock, and that is terrible for all in this debate.
I will call upon the executive of the decision.
Three questions today, adjudicator. Firstly, how do we reach the ultimate goal of stopping these conflicts and aggressions, which we all agree are the things that we don't want in today's world? Secondly, are these international laws worth upholding generally? Are they good writ large? And thirdly, do these laws eventually help to end the conflict, which is our goal? Our opponent's argument is, in essence, that terrorists are not humans, and so we should treat them however we want to because that's allowed, right? And we say that that's not preferable. We think that the most important thing, insofar as there's been this postulation that we don't understand terrorists, is to have a terrorist incentive. So we're going to have an accurate incentive. We're going to talk about terrorist incentives, we're going to talk about government incentives, and then we're going to talk about what my partner says that has not been covered adequately enough. But firstly, 2 points of rebuttal. So the first point that we heard in the last speech is that terrorism is not a legitimate enterprise, right? So sure, they don't deal in methodologies that are considered legitimate by the world at large, but we think that these are people that are seeking forms of legitimacy in the recognition that they are trying to achieve, right? So we think that even if we don't like the methods, it's not a reason to write off the people and the fact that they want something achieved in the very first place, right? The people themselves are not at fault for following orders from a governor or a state leader that's telling them to do the wrong things, right? It's more likely, we find it's more likely that they're going to continue following these orders if they have examples of us writing off their humanity, writing off their right to legitimacy by having continuous examples of a breaching of human rights, right? So they can say, oh, I just got tortured by this U.S. person. They really are the boogeyman that we've been sold this entire time. It's more reason to be able to recruit more people to have them more confidently follow that methodology that we say is bad, right? But secondly, we hear this idea that states are not going to, currently states do not adhere to the sort of international war laws that we're talking about, right? If that's a bad thing, that's a reason to push for more adherence to those laws, not a reason to abandon them altogether, right? Just because we're not currently carrying out these methodologies doesn't mean that they're not good, right? We would prefer a world where terrorists are being shown decency by our side, and in so doing are maybe incentivized to show that decency themselves, right? That is how we have a more equal form of warfare, not yet. Okay, so let's talk about these incentives, right? Recognize that terrorists have incentives that we think are important in today's round. Recognize that these organizations rely on inflamed relations. That is to say, any example that they can hold on to and spread propaganda about is the reason they're going to be able to recruit more people who are going to more blindly follow these sort of methodologies that we're condemning, right? This means that things like hate mongers are going to feed off of examples of us writing off the humanity of these people. They're going to say, look, the U.S. These states are monsters, just like we told you. Come join our cause. Come, commit your life to what we're doing, right? And this means that this is the most important thing, adjudicator. Counterfactual experiences, such as you being a terrorist and getting taken in by one of these states that you've been told for your entire life as a boogeyman, as a monster, as a horrible being, getting taken in by one of these soldiers and being shown decency, being given a meal, not being tortured, is going to be hugely impactful, because now on an individual level that we think eventually extends to a macro level, this is not quite as bad as they're telling us, right? There's not as much legitimacy, there's not much reason to follow this methodology as we've been told, right? So what we tell you is that this is a reason in and of itself to, this is a way that we basically stop the inflammation. This is a way that we stop these people blindly following these methodologies that we don't like back at.
Look, within domestic law, states abridge the rights of due process and all sorts of conventions they apply to them in instances where there's a direct threat to the public and it is imminent. Why is that not acceptable to do in international law?
The idea is that the threat is going to persist so long as they're allowed to sell this idea of us as a boogeyman, as us as a monster, someone that has no respect for their legitimacy, for their recognition, right? As long as we're willing to basically write off their humanity, they're going to be able to continue to recruit terrorists to that cause. If the eventual goal is to stop people from being killed, the way you do that is to stop people committing terrorism, right? By giving them the sort of legitimacy, I know that's horrible, but giving them the sort of legitimacy and recognition that they so want. That is how we stop having these terrorist attacks, right? But let's talk about the state incentive, because I think this is important as well, right? Recognize that the states currently, their ultimate goal is this conflict resolve, because we think that they get a lot more flack when there are instances of violence and aggression. Established states are going to receive a lot more flack from the public when you have people that are being killed, or instances of mass killing, etc., right? So what does increased aggression and violence actually do for these states that are under this guise of decency, right? First of all, it obviously delegitimizes this guise of decency. That is to say, if I'm a soldier and I'm being told to torture this person, I've been, I grew up reading history books that said America is morally upright, blah, 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 but suddenly now I'm being asked to torture someone, I start to seriously question that, which means on an internal level, there's a certain delegitimacy of the state and of their power, right? But this also, and this is the most important thing, this is the answer to his question, essentially, is that this feeds the narrative of the U.S. or of other states as the boogeyman, which is the very thing that allows these terrorist organizations to persist in the first place. The reason that they're allowed to go out and recruit these people is that they say, look, they don't care about us, they don't have respect for the things that we want, come and join our cause, right? So that is the answer to your question. It's like, sure, if it was a utilitarian thing, if you could actually end the conflict that way, maybe, but this is literally the way that they allow themselves to commit these acts of violence is by telling themselves that the U.S. are just as violent, just as bad as they are in the end. And in reality, if we're willing to commit torture, then I would argue that we are, not yet. Okay, so recognize that, like, above all, we think that the U.S. or these other states have a, they have an interest in maintaining moral righteousness. This is the very legitimacy by which they can send troops out in the first place, right? It's the idea that they believe that their support comes from believing that they're doing the right thing, that they're fighting the good fight, right? And again, when this becomes clear that they're not at the point in time which they are basically declaring an enemy, they're objectifying a people and saying that we are allowed to do whatever we want to do to achieve this cause. At that point in time, you start to question, is this cause really worthwhile in the first place? If these are the means by which we have to achieve them, right? We tell you that, you look at the Vietnam War, for instance, right? This is a war in which we went in blindly and we were willing to bomb and bomb and bomb and kill and kill and kill for as long as the government told us that we should. And when we came back, we had a huge anti-war movement that was horrible for veterans. They received a whole lot of hate because they realized that they weren't actually fighting the good fight, and that seriously delegitimized the state's authority. Quickly, please.
Every problem you've described applies to your side because the laws are never enforced. Is Israel more or less likely to fulfill its obligations to Palestinian citizens if Netanyahu can ridicule international law and stand up for bombers?
Just because it's not currently happening doesn't mean the idea of it working should be abandoned. If we can achieve this thing, this is the beauty of debate. This is not like the Senate, right? If it can work, if it is something that you think is preferable, you should vote for us. You should try and enact it. We think that it's certainly better to have less violence, right? But lastly, what does my partner tell you that goes woefully undercover? Three things. Firstly, terrorists are more complex than just an enemy, right? Terrorists have sort of incentives, sort of situations that we have to consider. The fact that they might not have been fully educated, the fact that they might be poor and that they have other coercive incentives, lies, propaganda, targeted recruiting that's using them. So they are humans. They do have this sort of consciousness of the fact that, or they could be introduced to a consciousness of the fact that what they're doing is not necessarily the right thing, right? But also he tells you that torture just doesn't work, right? It's hugely harmful to torturers themselves. It leads to people lying just to get out of the pain of and the violence of that situation, and it leads to more backlash from terrorists. Again, they're going to use this as fuel to add to more terrorism. So more violence is more reason to commit more acts of terrorism. But lastly, recognize that it turns the people to an enemy, to an object. At the point in time when you turn people to an enemy, anything is allowed. If this is not a human that I'm dealing with, but rather an object, I'm okay with committing as much violence as I need to, as much killing as needs to happen. We think that this could go off the walls. Very proud.
especially in a debate community like this, to root the principles of international law and its fundamental purpose in liberal egalitarian values of respect to human rights. And I think the beautiful case that comes from opening government probably illustrates the importance of that on a principled level. I think they're winning that debate. But international law is far more about just human rights. In fact, we think the facade of presentation of human rights with regards to international law is not the real reason as to why it exists. We're going to explain to you how international law serves an entirely practical purpose to incentivize states to engage in peaceful mechanisms of creating security, and why terrorist groups are immune from the incentives that international law provides in order to make sure that is true, and how they specifically, these poor, undereducated terrorists, actually know specifically what they're doing. They take advantage of the fact that they don't apply to the mechanisms of the purpose for why international law was created in 1913 and 42 in the very first place. We're going to be opening opposition on their grounds with some rebuttal in between, and hopefully preempt the extension we think is going to come from CO and win the debate. So, what is the foundation of international law? Like I said, I think opening government gives us some good primary reasons as to what that means, right? It's respect for human decency. It is the fact that it is an establishment between relations from state to state. That is true in nature in principle, but probably practically untrue. Why is that? We think the international law is based on a liberal doctrine founded in Westphalian principles. They are nonviolent mechanisms of cooperation, like forming peace agreements with other governments that have incentives to try and win popular support from their publics to try and make sure their country stays safe. They are incentivizing groups to de-escalate from conflict, like sanctioning states to make sure that they de-escalate rhetoric, or do things like disable their nuclear programs, or remove troops from the border to stop threatening other states and their sense of security. Human rights are actually an incentive to allow states to buy into that. What do we mean? We say that insofar as human rights exist and it's public good that we treat people with kindness, that's as far as the actual meaning of human rights go. That is to say, the only reason why they were added into the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and other different treaties that were written in was to make sure that states knew that other states respected the rights of the citizens that existed within those individual countries. That is to say that they cared far more about the mechanisms for international law that allowed for those sanctions to take place, the incentives that allowed states to engage with each other, far more than they pretended to care about the ethereal human rights and human decency that was talked about in the top half. We say the goal is to create an international regime of compliance to create peace and security. The extension of, quote, human rights are for purposes of creating the illusion of respect for individuals to create buy-in to that system in the very first place. CEOs rolling their eyes, but they're about to see why it's important. Terrorists do not deserve the same protections that are supposedly championed by the opening opposition for a couple of reasons. First of all, they are immune mostly to the negotiation process for two reasons. One, they reject the authority of the state in and of itself. So when we talk about groups like the Boko Haram or the rise of Islamic terrorism in places like the Sahel here in Africa, they're actually specifically battling the state and engage in quasi-negotiations with them, only to go and bomb their pipelines later to create disarray in the government. They don't actually care about negotiating with them because they don't have anything to bring home, right? They have nothing to lose. They're terrorist groups who are trying to overtake the state. In some places, establish caliphates, but in most circumstances, just destabilize the government so that they can take over instead. They have no susceptibility to things like public backlash. See, the Taliban, the reason that this is probably, like the Taliban and the FARC are probably the only two groups you are ever going to get on your side that are going to ever engage in these negotiations. The vast majority of terrorist networks do not care about creating relationships with the state. Second reason, they're unconcerned with winning things like public support. So these are ideologues who create radical responses in their own doctrines to mechanisms of government. So when opening opposition says, oh, well, they're just people who've been mistreated by state policies. That is true. Boko Haram formed in 1999 or 2001, we're not quite sure, as a response to the failures of the Nigerian government. They quickly became an opportunistic group that was recognized in order to loot other villages and loot other countries and steal their money and do things like exploit the natural resources that weren't being developed by the state. They're opportunistic political groups as opposed to these poor disenfranchised individuals, which means they don't care about winning public support, right? They literally kill other people and mutilate their generals to the point that they don't have to care about making sure they have enough support in the rural villages. The FARC is probably the only example who's ever really cared about that. Other groups just kill people indiscriminately because they don't care. Third and finally, they are an imminent danger to the public. I gave POI to opening opposition that was hand-waved away and responded to with a different piece of reputation. I'm not going to let you get away with it. Listen, in domestic law, when something is an imminent threat to the public, we bridge the civil rights of those individuals and see due process in order to protect the public. There's no reason as to why we shouldn't be doing that with international law, given that they're not going to stop killing people, right? You respond with saying, well, the propaganda that they use against states goes something along like this. Oh no, the international community didn't care about my rights. They are really the big bad wolves that we think they are. Doing something as simple as putting handcuffs around the terrorists is enough to create propaganda material to spark an insurgency, right? These people hate the state, they reject the international community at large. The differences in terms of propaganda that they can use is probably extremely marginal, whether or not you use human rights to protect them or not. It's not just about whether or not the international law is failing, it's that it quite literally should not apply to them in the very first place. And this is the really important part. Terrorist groups take advantage of the fact that these incentives are misaligned with the purpose of international law, and they take advantage of it in 4 different ways. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take closing.
A terrorist group that has 5 people in it isn't a particularly large threat. They obviously care about popular support to a certain extent so that they can grow their own size and become a real threat.
That is true probably in only 2 scenarios. The first is where they need to gain short-term support in order to do things like win over a community so they can steal their resources, pillage them, and then take them over without any of their consent. The second is this weird fanatical like world that the opening opposition creates where they actually care about the people that they're helping on the ground. The problem is that both of those scenarios are either one, extremely unlikely, or both completely negligible to the point where I think we should abridge those human rights in the very first place. How do they take advantage of the fact that we grant them to them anyways? First of all, it allows them to claim recognition by the international community. This is the comparative on the propaganda material we get from opening opposition. You know what's strong for a propaganda campaign for a terrorist group? Is saying, look, the international community treated me with human rights and respect. They brought me to the negotiating table and treated me just as a state would, or just like a state, which is precisely what allows them to continue their narrative and say, look, we are the new legitimate actor. We're beginning to overcome the state insofar they recognize that we exist. That's why we don't do things like negotiate with North Korea, sorry Trump, and things like, and people like the
the Taliban, because it failed. Second of all, they use the respect of international law in order to buy time. They give a really disingenuous piece of refutation to the opening government, which I thought was pretty bad. They're like, oh, well, torture doesn't really work, so we don't really need to use that. Listen, it's about far more than torture. When you give someone due process rights and give them a minimum sentence to throw them into a jail and they come back out and that leader is particularly charismatic or they have a really important vital role within that group, they come back, take advantage of the fact that they negotiated a plea deal with that international court. They come back, continue terrorizing civilians. Why is that? Because of the three things I told you in my speech. They don't care about public support, it's respect for the government, or the world as they know it. They want to destroy and destabilize, and that is their purpose, which is specifically why we shouldn't give them human rights. Problem with the debate thus far is that nobody really offers a vision for how it is that we actually end conflict with terrorists. The implicit advocacy up and down the government bench is that somehow we're going to eviscerate these terrorists. That's implied when they talk about things like torture, etc. But what we tell you is that that is not the way that you ever end terrorism. That you need feasible, sustainable negotiations that can occur in good faith. It is not just about the recruitment that opening opposition talks about, but rather of if you have the conditions for real negotiation that can be negotiated in such a way that you can give people the addressing of their grievances and you can give them a credible promise that you are not going to attack them after they choose to lay down their arms. If you can't do that, and we're going to tell you that they eviscerate that on their side, you can never end terrorism sustainably because you always maintain the motives that terrorists had to fight in the first place. That's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to do a little bit of rebuttal against opening government, much of which is reiterated by the closing government. What are the issues that they have on their side? Number one, they say that people are going to get upset about this, and this is lumped together, I think, with the idea that terrorists are tortured and people have broad general support for this, and you actually do have torture. Number one, we dispute the factual premise of this to the degree that when the Abu Ghraib scandal came out, the United States had to largely discontinue its use of private military contractors for fear of things like torture and accountability vis-a-vis those things. Number two, that Bush left the office with a 22% approval rating, and Obama campaigned on the notion that he would end torture, he would close Guantanamo, and do those sorts of things. People like to have the moral high ground, and people like to say that they didn't do these kinds of things, so you do get public support for these things in many instances. But to the degree that they want to talk about enforceability and whether or not this actually happens, there are two considerations. The first consideration is to consider the fact that on the margin, countries, when this is an international law, have a reticence to violate this to the extent that they're worried that it will trigger them the refusal of benefits elsewhere. That is, oftentimes when there are arguments made against Turkey acceding to the EU, that involves their treatment of the PKK in their country. And so it's lumped together, that they are denied benefits when they violate other laws. This means that countries do have an incentive in the status quo to follow these laws because they worry that a wholesale violation of human rights is something that could deny them other benefits that are economic, etc. I think that's something that is ignored on their side. But the other thing to note is just, if you change the law on their side and you really disregard it, you're just going to get less enforcement. Because now you set a very distinct precedent that if you ignore an international law sufficiently, we are going to discontinue that law and we're going to change the law to accommodate. That really erodes the ability to have power in enforcing international norms and international laws to the degree that it shows that flaunting those laws actually gets you what you want in the first place. So I don't think it's true on their side that one, there's no enforcement for these sorts of laws, but two, they just obviously get less on their side. Now, let's get... Sure.
Guantanamo remains open. The UK refused to release the IRA after peace was made, which is why Turkey wouldn't be worried about the UK holding them up in the EU. You might get a little bit more enforcement. Contrast that to the huge effect on the credibility of all other international...
No, but consider the fact that when we were fighting ISIS in the same place that we were fighting Al-Qaeda, we didn't employ torture measures. That we weren't so blasé about doing any of these sorts of things. The fact is that, yes, we are not claiming perfect enforcement, but
but it's just so obvious that on their side they get literally zero, whereas on our side there is an intrinsic risk aversion that these countries exhibit in actually doing the kind of violation of these laws. It is the reason why most countries won't use chemical weapons. It is the reason why having things written down very explicitly, the way that when we have red lines, matters very much, and we want to enforce them. These those are good. I don't know whether they can. Okay, extension. Why is it the case that on their side, they eliminate the ability to credibly negotiate? Here's what happens, two things. Number one, if a government demonstrates that it is willing to use any means necessary in order to fight these terrorists, or sometimes labeled as freedom fighters, what does that show that the government is willing to do? It says the government is strictly pragmatic and has no commitments to doing particular things a particular way. That means that when they make a promise such as, if you lay down your arms, we won't attack you, we will reintegrate you, there is no credibility to that promise because this is a government that has been torturing you, it is a government that has reneged on international promises that nominally they say there are for. And that means that there's no reason to believe them. That means that, one, these terrorists don't even come to the negotiating table in the first place, which obviously has two very important effects. Number one, what it means is that it doesn't signal to the average individual who supports these terrorist groups that they should stop fighting. What do we mean by this? Their conception of terrorist groups was that they work isolated from society, but we all know that that's not the case. We know that for every terrorist, there are 10 people who are massively sympathetic, who are willing to house them, keep them from the government, and allow them to exert their asymmetric force, basically, right? Because most governments are stronger than most terrorist organizations. The only reason that they can survive is that they're able to hide amongst the population, which obviously requires a large amount of support in most cases. I'm not going to take you don't have to stand up. What is the implication? That if you can't get the most extreme people to negotiate in the first place, you can't signal to those other people who are sympathetic that their demands have to some degree been met. What is the other implication? That you can't even try to meet their grievances. Now these guys say, well, what is going to happen when these people go away? They'll just come back and start fighting you. It buys them time, etc. But you eliminate the motives when you actually get them to negotiate in the first place, because their motives were that the government wasn't meeting their grievances and the political process wasn't working for them. So when the PKK is bombing places, it's because they want material benefits. But if you can't get them to the negotiating table, you can't in the first place give them those things, make those kinds of promises, or have credibility for those promises. This is the thing that they miss on their side, that they somehow think you're going to wipe out all of these people, and you're going to wipe out all of their sympathizers who they need to exist. But that's going to be feasible. Of course not. The only way you can do this is if you somehow meet their grievances. But the prerequisite to meeting any of their grievances is getting them to the negotiating table to seize the conflict. That is the nature of ending conflict in these instances that nobody wanted to talk about. The credibility of promises in those negotiations. What is the other thing? Actually, what is the other thing that they say? They say there's no susceptibility to public backlash. But I think that this argument clearly demonstrates that that's not the case, because if you think about cases like the Anbar Awakening in 2006 in Iraq, the way that we started to beat Al-Qaeda is we got popular support for people informing against the insurgency. That is, we were able to get rid of some of that support. And we think that the only way you can do that is if you make these kinds of promises. Look, you don't need to negotiate with the heads of these terrorist groups. You just need to have feasible integration programs that you can leverage. But you can't have that if the average terrorist member, who is usually just a Joe nobody, doesn't think that they can get any real benefits because they don't think they can trust these governments. The only way you get them to trust this is constraining them in some degree by international law and reducing the prevalence of these tactics in the number of cases that we talk about. That is how you end conflict, and because we're the only team that shows you a feasible route to ending conflict, we are incredibly proud to oppose. Thank you.
So the turn from closing government in this debate is that human rights aren't real, or at least they're not metaphysically real. That is to say, they've been made up for a purpose.
They've been made up because we recognize that suffering is bad, and because states want a reciprocal relationship where certain things don't happen, and when they go to war, there's certain observances by both sides. We would say that when terrorists are not part of that community and do not buy into those norms, that they necessarily do not get to be part of the made-up game that the Western liberal world has called human rights. 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, why does international law and human rights exist? Secondly, should we protect terrorists? And thirdly, can we actually stop terror on our side of the house, weighing with closing opposition within this motion? All right, firstly, why does international law and human rights exist? Robert tells you that basically the principles of international law and human rights exist because states want a reciprocal system of compliance, right? They want to live in a world where certain factors are observed and certain base level observances are made so that states can work together in a certain way. This isn't that they're large scale cooperation between states, but this is kind of the recognition. It's like if we're going to war and going to go to war and kill each other, at least we won't use chemical weapons. So why is this so important, right? It's so important because we have to recognize the reason that these codes existed in the first place is because these states wanted protections for their soldiers. They wanted a reciprocal understanding that certain elements wouldn't be used in war. This is how Robert contextualizes the arguments that come from any government. Because this reciprocity argument isn't simply, oh, terrorists don't buy in, so they shouldn't be part of it. The reciprocity argument gets its power because these are made up in the first place, and the only reason they actually matter is because people buy in. Yeah. So when Sion tells us in his speech, the reason we ban chemical weapons is this. We agree. We have banned chemical weapons for a very practical reason, but when terrorists don't buy into those practical reasons, what's the purpose of giving it to them? Sure. Opening opposition has this rhetoric where it's like opening government doesn't think they're people. It's like, of course we think they're people, but what does that word mean? And why does that mean they automatically get human rights? These concepts were made up, and there's not some deity out there that's going to constrict us in this debate by saying human rights are something real that we have to follow. Should we protect terrorists then? 2 responses, what does opening opposition give us for why we should protect them? Firstly, they say that they don't choose the terrorist life, so why, they just followed errors, so why should we protect them? The response to this is opening opposition. Would you abdicate the individuals in the Nuremberg trials who said, I was just following Hitler's orders, right? We just don't think this is a generally accepted principle, and people still have some autonomy over their actions. Obviously, life is a combination of being coerced and sometimes making their own actions, but we think when you're killing children, largely you're making some kind of choice. The second thing they say is using these tactics feeds terrorist rhetoric. But the problem with opening opposition is they don't think of the comparative. That is to say, they don't tell us why it is when we give terrorists human rights that they necessarily stop being terrorists. They tell us all these reasons that not giving them human rights might make it worse, but we think largely in the world where these rights exist, we don't see them being followed, and we also don't see less terrorist groups, so I don't think that they won on that side of it. Right? 2 principles Robert gives you about why we shouldn't protect terrorists, 2 very important principles for the debate. The first principle is that, look, any principle that exists is not absolute, and we often allow the subversion of a principle in certain circumstances. So most of the time, principles of rights and principles thing, it's not necessarily this always has to be followed, but it's preferable if it be followed, and it's preferable that we should use other alternative mechanisms instead of resorting to this mechanism. So this is we should try to sanction states instead of going to war with them. This is saying we should try to go into negotiations instead of just torturing someone and killing them. What Robert gives you in his speech is the reason that we don't protect terrorists is because these kinds of other avenues don't apply. So we'd say if a burglar comes into your house and you can tase them and subvert them that way, that would be preferable. But if you can't tase them, we're it's okay if you blast their head off to protect your family. What does Robert give you? First, it's because they're not states, you can't really sanction them. You can't use these kind of economical tactics to turn them away from terrorism. But the second thing he says is largely because they disregard the concept of the state, you can't negotiate with them. Compare this directly with what the member of opposition gives us. Because the member of opposition says look, they won't negotiate when we start violating the rights, and the big thing we want is to make it so they can negotiate, bring them to the table. 3 responses. Firstly, this only applies in the limited cases, because we think in some cases of terrorist groups, they don't want to negotiate. Taliban does not want to negotiate with the Pakistani government. They want the Islamic State, and they won't compromise. There's no negotiations to be had. Secondly, we would say, there's examples where brutalizing has worked, brutalizing people's rights has worked in bringing people to the negotiation table. We think the Colombian government did do brutal things to FARC, and that was partially the way that they were able to bring FARC to the negotiation table, when FARC was man, Colombia's really brutalizing us, we're not going to get out of this situation, we might as well negotiate. But thirdly, oftentimes negotiations haven't started until after groups have stopped being terrorists in the first place. We don't think Ireland really came to negotiate with the IRA until they're the IRA's first, their ambitions became more realistic so they could actually negotiate. But secondly, the IRA also started bombing places where innocent children died. We don't necessarily think that their argumentation first applies in most cases where terrorist groups don't want to negotiate, but even in the cases where it does apply, we don't think they gave us sufficient words to say that these people won't come to the negotiation table when their rights are being violated. On to the third question then. Can we stop terror? Before that, PY from Open.
So terrorists use enmity as fuel to allow themselves to continue these monstrosities. We then told you that examples of restraint on the state's behalf would severely decrease the legitimacy of those terrorist movements and even encourage them to example restraint themselves in the future.
But this is just like not the case. If you're a terrorist group and you're like dead set on making an Islamic state, and then like the other, like the international community is like treating you with respect, you don't just like start thinking we should treat the rest of the international community with respect. If you're already based upon and predicated upon a radical ideology of like world takeover or takeover of a certain region, you're not going to have reciprocal and mutual respect between different states. We think Robert like turned this argument when he said it's probably different. We think the Islamic State would have a better time recruiting individuals if they were started to seen as legitimate by the international community. We don't think this is necessarily the case. And like with this like charging on enmity thing, I think like a good response to this is like, okay, if your terrorist rhetoric is like, look, your government is killing people, so why don't you go kill some innocent children? We don't think individuals who are going to kill innocent children are really going to be that swayed by a rhetoric of stop the government from killing people. Okay, can we stop terrorism then? Opening opposition's like, no, torture doesn't work. Robert's like, other things, we can do other things besides torture. For example, not letting the charismatic leader of the terrorist group out of jail after the war has occurred. But closing opposition's like, look, there's a large support for rights. Like, there's a large support to give terrorists human rights. Closing opposition talks about, like, there's the public support, like, against Guantanamo Bay. The two responses I had for this is, like, one, that's in the United States where they're not feeling the direct harms of the terrorist group. I think the individuals who are actually having their families killed don't have that same support. But secondly, like the Prime Minister pointed out, Guantanamo Bay still happens. We don't really see it in the news that often. It's still there. That public support hasn't really done anything practical. We think we can reasonably stop terror, and there's no reason, if human rights and international law are made up, to really let terrorists be applied.
Now we call on its
At its best, if we agree with everything that we heard out of the government bench, what we get is a couple terrorist cells being shut down. We get a little bit of intel from torture. We don't think that leads to any sort of sustainable solution to these type of conflicts. The best comparative in this round, I think, is done explicitly by the closing opposition, that the way in which you actually solve terrorist crisis is not by engaging in brutal tactics, which is what 95% of countries do, which is why almost all terrorist incidents are recurring. But the way you actually solve it is by having the type of reintegration into these societies. That is, that you have to provide people either guaranteed spots in parliament, you provide them with jobs, you provide them and monitor them to make sure that they can actually be successful to address those underlying grievances. This not only, I think, is the best solution to the terrorism problem, but also the best addressing of the actual principle here. Because what we hear out of OP government doesn't say that we have a moral obligation to torture people, it just says, well, we don't have a reason not to. And what we hear out of closing government is say we actually have an affirmative reason because the principle is pragmatic. Well, it's not particularly pragmatic to just solve a crisis at its top level and not actually lead to any sort of sustainable solution. Let's talk first about the sustainable solution before talking what are the general implications for international law. First, on how we construct the sustainable peace. The best argument that we hear out of open government, and developed a little bit with new proper nouns and closing government, is that these terrorists are still a threat when they return back to the war fields. Here are the two reasons we give why this isn't the case. First off, they lack the actual capacity to do so, given how we can still monitor these terrorists after they leave, and two, that we've already destroyed the network. That is, we don't have to release the terrorists while they are still engaging in it. You release them after the conflict at least has abated to a certain extent. Second off, they lack the motivation to do so, because we think by and large the vast majority of them are sympathizers, and if they can get access to jobs, or at the very least they have something at stake by engaging in a terror cell, they're much less likely in order to engage this. This is why we see these type of reintegration techniques work actually throughout the entire world. The better response that we hear from closing government is that, look, these terrorist groups are never going to negotiate. Now, I think this is largely factually false, and I think they acknowledge this. Now, it is true that a lot of countries don't negotiate because the countries themselves don't want to negotiate with them in the first place, not because the terrorist groups are principally opposed to the construction of the state. Most of these terrorist groups, in many cases, want to take over the state. This is what we see, for instance, with ISIS. But here's the other thing. We don't even need to negotiate with the terrorist leadership, the people they say who reject this idea. Well, all we need to do is negotiate, or at least get the acquiescence of the individuals who are terrorists that we locked up. We say, we don't need the top line people to say, we're going to disband. We just need the people we capture to reintegrate them into society and have that. So it's not enough for them to say that the Taliban top line people aren't going to negotiate if the individuals are still going to be open to the idea that they can return to their family and get some job and have something at stake. Then they make the interesting argument to say, well, isn't it the brutal tactics are what bring them actually to the table? And isn't that going to help this type of process? Not true. Although that only applies specifically to terrorist organizations, the fact of the matter is that for most of these organizations, individual members are expendable, because for every single person they have in the organization, there's 10 different sympathizers, which is why that making sure that we reduce that number of sympathizers is so important for sustainable peace. How do we do this, and why are we the best team in order to be able to do this? Precisely because what happens is when the most extreme people, that is the people who are so extreme that they got captured by Western power, get locked up, moved abroad, etc., the most extreme, right? If they're willing to put down their arms and they're willing to reintegrate society, that sends very strong signals to all the people who are more at the margins, all these potential recruits for future type of insurgencies and terrorist groups, that they themselves, that even most extreme people see a path to peace in the future, which is why we actually specifically reduce it. Okay, good question.
At best, your case is for a separate convention about negotiators' rights. If you want states to look credible making agreements, don't sign them up to an outdated agreement you concede is mostly unenforceable, and then release terrorist extremists to fight against that agreement.
Right. This is a great segue to talk about the next major issue around is what is the implications for general international law. What we hear and what we just heard here is that basically you undermine all commitments that countries have when you just don't enforce this type of law. And I think the response we actually heard from opening is quite good, which is maybe we should just enforce it more. That's not a reason to abandon it. But let's say you don't believe that that is something that is feasible. Here's the thing. 3 things are actually the thing. First off, this is completely uncomparative. As I alluded to in the POI, what weakens your commitment to international law more? Saying weakly enforcing it, or saying if you continue to ignore international law, maybe we'll just revoke it. So that is, even if we set specific rules for terrorists and non-combatants, that if you violate the law for specific state-by-state violence and those type of combatants, that we'll revoke it themselves. Second off, we think that even if it is weakly enforced right now, because I think we all agree that even if we aren't perfect, that Guantanamo Bay and indefinite detention still exists, but waterboarding we were able to get rid of precisely because of these type of norms, even if it is somewhat weakly enforced, that doesn't mean there isn't a path for stronger enforcement in the future. This is what Sinan points out with the example about chemical weapons, which emerges after World War I, and you have very weak norms about it to the extent that the West uses chemical weapons when we invade Vietnam. But what happens we see nowadays? The norm gets stronger and stronger because you build up the institutions around it to the point where it is enforceable. That the use of chemical weapons specifically in Syria is what motivated President Obama to act. He didn't follow his red line, which is what they're all standing up about. But you know what he did do? He bombed Syria. He specifically risked confrontation with Russia in Syria because, in large part, because there was pressure, popular pressure, to not be seen as weak. That we made a commitment, when we signed these declarations, we made a commitment to other countries that we are going to stop and enforce international law. And things like chemical weapons are beyond the pale. Maybe it's the case that right now these type of norms are particularly weak, in large part because this whole conversation about terrorism got a lot stronger and changed dramatically after 9/11. But it's not the case that these can't develop more in the future. This argument is not actually a particularly compelling argument for why we should completely abandon
More time.
it. However, the last point here is why we think this is actually going to strengthen this type of international law. Because we think that it's very easy for these type of governments to use the fact that they are a terrorist and label someone as a terrorist and use it as an excuse to torture people more or to not uphold their commitments. This is the argument that Sima gives you, that most of these governments are particularly short-termist. They don't actually have this type of commitment to long-term peace. Now, you know who thinks this argument is good? It's not just me. Also opening government. They try to squirrel out of this by saying we're just going to have courts that are going to enforce it, and international courts. But the extent to which few people buy in, but creating more loopholes gives people more opportunities to exploit it. Here's the fact of the matter. We don't just need new norms regarding negotiations like they try to characterize our argument. What we actually need in order to be able to have some sort of sustainable peace is be able to return these former combatants and these former terrorists to the places that they lived before, send a signal to all the other potential recruits for future terrorist uprisings in the future that even the extremists themselves were reintegrated in society. And we can guarantee their reintegration through things like monitoring or things like breaking down their cells. At the end of the day, you could agree with everything they said, but they still don't get any sustainable solution. Only by actually returning them to the battlefield, not engaging in torture, do you get that sustainable solution, which is why we're so proud to oppose.